I wanted to talk about love and psychedelics and maybe see what similarities or comparisons we can draw from there, as they seem to me to be quite similar. And my project here is really twofold. So it's to look at psychedelic-assisted therapy, or PAT, from a narrative perspective, and then draw comparisons with the narrative structures of love. And I also just want to say that this idea is still very much taking shape in my head for me, so I appreciate any thoughts or comments that you might have as we go through this. Just before we start, I have no conflicts of interest to declare, and I also want to thank Brian Earp and Pilar Lopez-Cantero for their helpful feedback on this project. So just to give a brief structure or overview to this, I'm going to start first with giving an introduction to narratives and narrative identity, and then looking at how PAT can affect our self-narratives, and then looking at love and psychedelic narratives and seeing what implications can come from this comparison. So starting with why narratives might be interesting for PAT, there's a long lineage of research that looks at how recovery comes about from a change in self-narrative. So for example, philosopher Hannah Pickard, she writes that all recovery requires some form of agential effort. And this agential effort is tied to our self-narratives. So Doug McConnell and Anke Snoek also write that self-narration is necessary but not sufficient for self-governance. And this is because our narratives help us to kind of plan and make is part of recovery. And there has been some work on self-narratives in the psychedelic field. So Nicole Amada and her colleagues have done a qualitative study on how the psychological benefits that we see with PAT come about from a change in our narrative selfhood. So I'll start with a brief overview of what exactly is a narrative. The idea might be familiar to many. We could think of like stories, myths, legends. These are all narratives. Catriona Mackenzie gives a really nice definition. I won't read it out entirely, but just hitting some of the key points. It's really an organizing structure that explains actions and events by integrating them into a coherent temporal pattern and sequence. It's not just a list of events. There has to be some kind of integration for the whole thing. So narrative identity, then, it might be very logical, is the idea that our identities and lives have the structure of our narrative. And according to this view, the narratives that we tell about our lives help us to describe and plan for our future, what we hope to experience and accomplish. For example, they basically make sense of our past and our future as well. But it's important to note that we're also not the only tellers of our stories. So we all have many co-authors, and they can take many roles. So one example is that we all depend on people around us for verification of our stories. If I go around and start telling people that I was born from a snake, no one is going to believe me. And this will make my narrative much harder to sustain because I have to maintain it in the face of all of this rejection. And we can also disvalue our narratives. So McConnell and Snoek, on their work in addiction, so they go into this by giving the example of someone who values recovery, but this conflicts with their established narrative of continued drug use. So we can see why this conflict can occur and persist. They bring in this idea of narrative momentum, which I'm going to come back to later in the presentation. So it's this idea that we have certain narrative threads that are more consistently verified and established by the people around us. And these threads then become the facts that others take to be true about us. And so we have pressure to narrate according to these established threads for several reasons. One, because we value the opinions of our co-authors. It can feel self-deceptive to narrate threads that are opposite to these established threads, for example. So these established threads and their narrative momentum can undermine our own self-governance, and as we'll come back later, can also undermine recovery. So briefly going into how might our self-narratives be affected by PAT. So I think one way to look at it is that our altered states of consciousness provide a venue for our agent to resolve conflicts between their values and self-narrative. It allows us to see narrative threads and possibilities that we couldn't normally see during normal states of consciousness, as one example. And it also allows for opportunities for us to reflect upon and really reinterpret some threads to be more in alignment with our values. So for example, we can look at an event in our past and no longer think I was a victim, but a survivor. This kind of interpretation is something that it offers us as well. But I think it's also important to note that recovery doesn't just come about from the insights that we get during this trip, and maybe this goes into Max Wolf's talk later, that psychotherapy is really important for this in the whole integration phase. They write that whether a new narrative thread is ultimately integrated more permanently into our wider self-narrative depends on successfully enacting it and convincing others of its truth. And so this goes back to the importance of our co-authors as well. So now bringing in love, we can start by kind of looking at their narrative structures and going into a little bit in more depth of how recovery might come about. And so I take this psychedelic assisted therapy to be a kind of psychedelic narrative. We have a defined period of time, although the end might be a little hazy, but I take it for this project, you can clearly define it. And we have a temporal sequence of events. And so we can have this limited closed hole that we can examine. And this is where I bring in the idea of love as well. So I think lots of other things unfold over time. We might think of grief, hate, lots of other emotions that change us. And I think love is particularly interesting to examine because it seems to change our self-understanding as well. So love has also its own narrative structure. We can think of the beginning of a relationship or falling in love all the way to falling out of love or the end of a relationship. So my project here is really comparing the two narrative structures and seeing how they can prompt us maybe to think differently about psychedelic assisted therapy or what implications. So although we should start with what exactly is love, there are a million definitions out there. For this and the following slides, I use Pilar Lopez-Cantero's work on the narrative structures of love. And the definition that she uses you to, and I take as well, is that love changes our self-understanding. And it does this in two ways. So firstly, interpretation. The person we love reveals new things about us and leads us to new beliefs. And second, the person we love directs us towards certain actions that we otherwise would not have taken. So we start now into kind of how could we compare their two narrative structures. This is kind of how I envision it looking. We have the beginning for the psychedelic narrative. This would be falling in love, or for the psychedelic narrative, it would be marked by the trip, and with love, it would be falling in love. And then we move to the middle, and then where we have integration and the long-term effects of psychedelic assisted therapy. And then we have the end of love or the end of the therapeutic effects. So we start with the beginning of love. So Lopez-Cantero describes this as a trigger for the changes in self-understanding to be built over time. And this might seem very similar as well to psychedelic assisted therapy. And for love, this is because it opens up a whole new branch of possibilities for us. When we fall in love, we see like opportunities for things that may not have appeared before. And she calls this branch of possibilities as existentially charged. It's that feeling that we have that everything makes sense when we fall in love, and it provides a fundamental point of orientation for our narratives. And I think psychedelic assisted therapy and its narrative might look very similarly as well. It's also the altered states of consciousness as a trigger for our changes in self-understanding. And we have new narrative threads and possibilities that are revealed to us. So this was taken from a study on smoking cessation, where the participant wrote, "It's me, there are no defining characteristics that made me realize I'm not a smoker." So our narratives, we can reinterpret them, they're revealed to us in new ways during these altered states of consciousness, and we see possibilities that were not visible before. So moving then to the middle of love, or the period after the psychedelic trip. So the question here is really, why do we remain in love even after we've fallen in love? Or why do we see these therapeutic effects come about? So we turn to the question of why we remain in love. Lopez-Cantero uses this idea of our self-narrative feeding into our behavior. And it gets a little circular, but it's essentially how who we are influences how we see the world, while our way of seeing the world influences what we do. And what we do then influences our actions and behavior and our beliefs, and as we get this feedback loop that sustains the narrative momentum of love. And so I think we can look at the psychedelic narrative in a similar way. We get all of these insights from the psychedelic experience, but we must act on them in order for the narrative to continue and for the momentum to be sustained. So if we take the example from before, an agent will have to change his actions and his lifestyle in order to better align with his new belief that he's not a smoker, for example. And this is self-reinforcing and contributes to the continuing belief that he's not a smoker. But even if we can see why people would remain in love and why the therapeutic effects of psychedelics come about, love also ends. And sometimes we see the therapeutic effects of psychedelics also wear off, maybe after 6 to 12 months. So to see why this is so, we can turn to the end. So Lopez-Cantero distinguishes between two types of falling out of love. We have non-volitional and volitional ends. And a volitional end would be deliberately bringing about the circumstance needed to fall out of love, whereas non-volitional ends are simply just falling out of love with no conscious intervention. And so she argues that this happens when we realize that our mental states have shifted such that the narrative momentum can no longer be sustained. And I think there are some comparisons to be made with the psychedelic narrative as well. So just as with love, our psychedelic narrative ends when our thoughts no longer align with what would allow the psychedelic narrative to continue. And there are a number of reasons why this could happen. So going back to McConnell and Snook's work on narrative momentum, this can be because this new narrative thread of recovery is rejected by all our co-authors, and this makes it significantly more difficult for us to maintain it in the face of all this rejection. So for example, if I believe that I can recover, but everyone else around me thinks I'm going to relapse, it's going to be very difficult for me to actually recover without the support. And also, it can feel almost self-deceiving if you look at some people feel that this new narrative thread of recovery feels almost foreign or dissimilar to them, and it's not truly them. So these established narrative threads can really undermine our self-governance and all contribute to the end of the psychedelic narrative. So although I've drawn comparisons in their structures, I think there are also a lot of similarities in how they impact our narrative identity. So both of them change our self-understanding, I think, to some extent. And I think, interestingly, both also present a vulnerability in our narrative identity. So with psychedelics, we have this classical period of heightened suggestibility where people can more easily influence us. And for love, we can also, going back to the idea of interpretation and direction, think of cases where the person we're in love with may not be the best for us, lead us to hold beliefs about ourselves that may not necessarily be true, for example, or direct us to take actions we might not have otherwise have taken. And finally, maybe going back to psychocryptic experiences, I think yet another similarity is that love can cloud our self-understanding, whereas psychedelics can also do the same thing. So we can think of the expression blindly in love, where self-understanding is clouded, we lose sense of who we are. And the same existential confusion can also occur with psychedelics. I think it's important to know that insight and recovery doesn't always come about, so both can lead to enhanced self-understanding or confusion. But I've also talked about so many similarities, you might be thinking they're so different. And I agree the comparison is not perfect, nor is it really meant to be. So one obvious one is the physical and psychological risk with psychedelics that should always be taken into account. The speed at which the change occurs is another one. So we might think that narrative change comes about much faster with psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy in comparison with love, although I think we can also think of cases where we fall in love overnight and the person becomes a completely different person. And obviously, I think the most obvious difference here is that love doesn't cause altered states of perception. We might think of the expression rose-colored goggles maybe for love as one case, although I'm not sure how convinced I am by that. But I think it's important to acknowledge these differences, but I still think interesting things can come from this comparison. So you might think, so what? I've drawn comparisons between love and psychedelics. What does this really say about PAT? So I think it just firstly gives us a different lens to think about psychedelic experiences and psychedelics in general. And I think it might also prompt us to think about whether a longer integration phase than what is currently given is needed. I'm drawing from the current models of PAT in clinical trials here, but if we think about McConnell and Snook's work on addiction and the narrative work that is needed to successfully adopt a new narrative thread, we might think that maybe more support from our family and communities than what is currently integrated in clinical trials is needed. And I think using this lens of narrative change can also point to the importance of the acute subjective experience. So there's been a lot of research into non-hallucinogenic psychedelics because we don't really know whether the acute subjective experience is necessary for the therapeutic effects, although this is also debated. But I think using this idea of narrative change and how recovery comes about can point to why the the acute subjective experience is so important. And finally, my background is in bioethics, so returning to a more bioethical space, I think comparisons with love or other phenomena can give us another lens to think through these issues. So informed consent is one issue that's frequently raised, such that the ineffability of the experience makes it extremely hard to give valid and informed consent to psychedelics. But I think if we accept that we can consent to falling in love, and getting married is another common one, love is similarly indescribable, and so I think it can prompt us to think differently about informed consent or maybe approach it in a different way. And also, the issue is also raised that psychedelics engender such unforeseeable effects to our identity that giving valid and informed consent is impossible. I think, like with love, we have similar risks to our identity that we consent to freely, and it's accepted that we do. So although I don't really have answers as to how these issues should be approached, I do think comparing them and looking at other similar phenomena can give us another lens to look at them through. And so finishing up with implications more broadly, I had another version of this presentation where I almost wanted to argue that maybe they're the same experience or they're very similar. I'm not sure if I want to go there. But maybe just looking at how other phenomena can help us to appreciate them for their effects upon our self-understanding. So in weird contexts, we're typically seeing them in this very medical context solely for their use on our pathologies. And I think if we look at love and psychedelics as both a venue for narrative change, where changes in self-understanding can come about, so maybe we can value them solely, not just in a medical context, but also for this. So with that, thank you for listening to this very preliminary project. And yeah, I'm looking forward to hearing any questions or criticism that you might have.
Thank you for your lovely presentation. First, if you may, I would like to challenge when you said that love is not a altered state of perception. I would say when you're in love, your perception is really altered in good ways and in bad ways. So, and also, have you thought, or I would like to ask, have you thought of maybe adding to this presentations or your thesis, or like the idea of tough love, like what also psychedelics can sometimes be, like they can really be harsh, like especially like mother ayahuasca and maybe also mushrooms, they can sometimes like show the truth that you really don't want to see. And that's also what a good friend does. Like a good friend tells you something that you don't want to hear. And also I think as a parent, you have kind of failed if your child always likes you, if you don't ever show some tough love and put boundaries. So have you thought of bringing this tough love idea with the psychedelics?
No, that's a really nice idea. I actually hadn't thought about that. And going back to love as altered states of perception, I think I agree. But what I was mainly trying to get at there was the walls don't breathe when we're in love. That like essentially the visual effects are not there. And I think that is one part. But I do think, yes, our perception is altered in some way. Maybe not to the degree or the extent with psychedelics, but it certainly is. And I think, yeah, the idea of tough love is really good. I'm going to note that down.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much for your presentation. I really think your emphasis on narrativity is quite important at this moment, especially when a sort of dominant psychometric approach treats events as quite causally closed and not within a whole narrative unfoldment of the experience. Anyway, I would like to ask you a question about confusion that you mentioned at the end there. Yeah. So a lot of what you spoke about was concerning how psychedelic experiences like love can provide, if I quote you, a venue for the agent to resolve conflicts between values and self-narratives, because they can facilitate insights and things can make sense in a different way. But I think also an important part about psychedelic experiences is events or aspects of the experience that just do not make sense, that there's no possible way of fitting it into a narrative or integrating it in any way. I don't think that has to be negatively characterized as a clouding of self-understanding. It could, in fact, be a kind of insight that some things just do not make sense. And I wondered if you think that could also be therapeutically valuable for people to sometimes have experiences that do not make sense and to accept that, rather than to attempt to integrate. Yeah.
Thank you for your question. I do very much think so. I think that while certainly there are experiences that we don't understand and this can be beneficial for us, and I think that can be therapeutic on its own, but I do think there are also cases where psychedelics confuse us in not necessarily a beneficial way. A lot of people, there are some cases where people come out worse off after using psychedelics, and we might not necessarily want to treat that as therapeutic. So although I do think there's benefit, both have to be considered, essentially.
Yes, thank you. I really enjoyed the narrative viewpoints. I was kind of wondering about the difference, and like falling in love, it kind of gives you a role or a sense of identity instantly, and compared to psychedelic experience, which can be kind of confusing and increase the sense of uncertainty and negative affect, which isn't really that much part. I was wondering if it's more like disintegrating when it comes to the narrative of your life, the psychedelic experience, than the instance of falling in love. Because falling in love, there is kind of ready-made model or template how to integrate it to one's journey.
Right.
And psychedelic is more like disintegration. Of course, I also agree that it can be a reintegrating agent as well, kind of provide interpretive resources, something like that. But I'm just wondering about the distinction, because at least in our culture, there isn't really a kind of ready-made role or sense of identity after the post-experience.
That's a really nice question. Yeah, I think that's really important, and it goes back to kind of the set and setting, and as well as there has been some work on, like you said, right now in our Western context, we don't really have a model or kind of a role where psychedelics fit, but I think it's important to acknowledge that other cultures do. And they do kind of have this model and how it fits within their society. And it's much better integrated than I think than you go into a clinical trial, you take a psychedelic, you have like 3 weeks of integration and then you leave. So I think in other settings and other cultures, it's much better supported and you can integrate it much easier. You have these rituals before and after. It's really much more incorporated, I think, into their like overall narratives.
Yeah, thank you for the insightful presentation. Considering that the history of psychotherapy and also psychedelic therapy is also a history of transgressions, do you think there's perhaps a danger that people may misunderstand those parallels between love and psychedelic experiences? And use it as a justification to start, I don't know, intimate relationships with patients. Does this perhaps need a disclaimer?
Yeah, no, I think that's definitely important. And unfortunately, I didn't have the time to go into it more, but like and how psychedelics present a vulnerability to our identity. I think in both cases, there's possibilities for transgressions to occur. I think we can think of the same transgressions with love and relationships as well. So I don't want to say that they're exactly the same and that this is a justification for like relationships and such like that. It was really to look at self-understanding, but I think they present the same dangers as well for identity and for transgressions to occur.
Yeah, thanks for the presentation. I have a bit shorter question. So I saw the 3-step model about like different steps of love and also psychedelics. So to me, it seems like according to this model, love always ends, and also psychedelic effect always ends. So this may be my only critique of the presentation. Like, could there be like, I know it's possible it might end, but is there also like another path?
Yeah, I think that's true. Like, love doesn't always end. I don't want to say that. And maybe the therapeutic effects can also occur, but I think then you're really just looking at, like, you're staying in the middle, essentially. But I think it's also looking at there is an end, and that's what this whole arc is supposed to look like. But if love doesn't end, if the therapeutic effects don't wear off, then you're kind of just in the middle, and that continues.
identifying oneself as being in love means certain ethics. You help the person who you're in love with, you don't hurt them. It's very clear. What about ethics of being in psychedelics as a researcher, user, practitioner?
That's an aspect, yeah, I haven't thought about more yet. I think it's a really interesting point. Yeah, love does come with certain obligations. And while looking at psychedelics this way makes us think about the relationships associated with us, I think if we think about the point about vulnerability and transgressions, I think we also have that ethical obligation not to transgress and to, to take advantage of the vulnerability that psychedelics present to us as just one case.
I had a comment regarding the confusion of maybe produced by psychedelics and the kind of after effects. And at ICPR last year, there was the panel of participants in the psychedelic trials. And Leonie Schneider talked about how the participants often may feel left alone after the trials, having experienced a massive transformative, ineffable experience, and afterwards having little peer support or difficulty justifying their new experiences to other people. This was really interesting. I think this connects to that forming of those narratives after psychedelic therapy. It would be kind of like being in love, but the one you're in love with is invisible, and you cannot like explain it to anyone.
Yeah.
I think I just wanted to make this comment. I think this was a really fascinating presentation. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate it. It's also a topic I've been thinking about more. If you look at a lot of the kind of qualitative studies of like post-ayahuasca use or post-clinical trials, a lot of people speak about this rawness when they're going back into their ordinary lives, and the fact that no one else around them seems to understand this experience that they've went through and like why they think this. David Dupree's work in Peru, he talks about the participants going there, they had this experience, and they returned to France where everyone kind of looks at them as if they're crazy. Like, you came back, you said you're cured of your addiction because you went through an ayahuasca retreat. Like, it doesn't seem to make sense. So I think those kinds of things are really interesting, and they really point to the importance of like the co-authors in our narrative, and maybe makes a case for like including more of our community during psychedelic assisted therapy, because essentially you're just going back, and if no one understands, I think it's going to be very hard to maintain that.
Thank you. Excellent talk, excellent discussion. Thank you.